Zuhdi Jasser is here with us now. He's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He is covering a terrorism trial down in Phoenix that, quite honestly, is getting very little coverage. So that's why we're here with him, because it's important. Dr. Jasser, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Buck. Thank you so much for having me.
So you are there to keep an eye on this trial, and currently they have Abdul Kareem on trial for supporting terrorism, being involved in terrorist plotting. He was not one of the shooters at the Garland, Texas Draw Muhammad cartoon contest, because, well, they were both killed by a police officer. But he was what? He was associated with them? He was helping them? Please tell us what the charges are, what the backstory is for this terrorism trial that you have been covering down in Phoenix.
Yeah, thank you for covering this. It's important because it's the first trial of an ISIS operative on American soil. And Abdul Kareem is charged with helping facilitate the armed attack on the Draw Muhammad cartoon contest, in which Simpson and Sufi were shot dead. And bottom line is the trial so far has begun to look into, he originally was part of a plot to bomb the 2015 Super Bowl. Then that was abandoned. He had over 60 different exchanges by text message and email with ISIS operatives abroad, which the FBI has revealed already. And he also had been providing arms training and has gone shooting with the shooters that were killed, and apparently was part of this cell. And he did not participate in the act itself on the day the terror attack occurred, but clearly was part of the cell. And, the coverage, what has been problematic is, the local media will go and interview the mosque that he attended. And at our American Islamic Forum for Democracy, Courtney Lonergan is our community outreach director, and she goes to that mosque. And she had been interviewed by the media here at length about how these people were known to the mosque. They were quite agitators, if you will. And the mosque now is just sort of deflecting all of that. They didn't radicalize them imminently as militants, but the atmosphere of being anti-American, anti-Semitic, the conspiracy theories, the fact that these guys who were quite radical just sort of hung out there. And the mosque's president on Channel 12 here locally last week said, yeah, he volunteered, and he was talking about Abdul Malik. He said, yeah, he volunteered here locally, but he sort of, we didn't know him that well. Well, there's such an amount of denial. This is a clinic right now in Phoenix of how Americans can learn sort of what's the conveyor belt that leads folks towards ISIS.
So you're telling me that it sounds like somebody back to our sort of New York City, see something, say something, that campaign that goes on here, someone in this mosque where Abdul Kareem and these others, the Garland shooters, were spending time, they were not, somebody should have said something? I mean, you think that they just kind of kept quiet because what?
Well, actually, that's a good question. No, I don't think anybody heard anything about plotting terror attacks. Typically, the process that happens with these groups, as we saw with the Boston bombers and the Chattanooga shooters, once they start getting militant and actually communicating with foreign operatives with ISIS, they will vanish from the local community. And that's probably what happened here. But right up until that point, up until the few weeks where they went from sort of wearing jerseys for ISIS to wearing military uniforms, once they want to put on the military uniforms, they vanish and they start planning their attack. And then these guys put some weapons in their car that apparently Abdul Malik here helped them get, the guy who was on trial. And then they drove to Texas to shoot up the Draw Muhammad contest. But before that, for years, these guys were hanging out, playing basketball with the other kids. They were, they weren't sort of strangers to the mosque. And the mosque's milieu of ideology was not exactly pro-American and or pro-Israel or necessarily it was about Muslims being victims, about the system being anti-Islam. Those are the types of ideas that foment and why we should use these trials as a clinic for reporters and others to begin to expose what is the ideology that radicalizes these individuals. And unfortunately, the narrative about Abdul Malik so far in the limited coverage of this trial has been that, well, he's just sort of an odd duck and nobody really knew him.
So there was a broader context for this ideology to at least get started, this sort of the jihadist outlook within Islam. You're saying that in this mosque there are people, and by the way, Zuhdi, when I was here in New York at the NYPD's intelligence division, counterterrorism work, look, every time we'd have one of these individuals that would was a lone wolf, had self-radicalized. There were people around him who didn't necessarily share the belief in taking violent action, but there was a common refrain. I mean, there was a sort of a common background in much of this, and that was that there's a lot of opposition, and opposition is not even the right word, a lot of sort of hatred of U.S. foreign policy, a lot of hatred of Israel. And while that's not illegal per se, it is highly questionable. And it is a sort of thing where, this happens enough in enough places, you would start to think that the media would be asking more questions, but the media is not asking many questions at all. I mean, honestly, Judy, if you weren't covering this, I don't think I would have heard of this trial.
And it's just, ISIS is in all 50 states. We want to begin to educate Americans about what is the process in which these individuals become separated out of society, what is the ideology that isolates them and creates these monsters that hate America and will begin to kill our citizens as they did in San Bernardino and elsewhere. The San Bernardino shooter, similarly, it appears that the ideology of Salafi jihadism from that mosque there, the imam at that mosque was posting truther comments about 9/11 being a Israeli operation and other things that anyone who would follow these ideas, as you know, in New York, the politically correct folks now have pretty much had the NYPD seminal report of 2007 on radicalization in the homeland removed from public access, which actually laid out those 4 stages of self-realization, of Islamization, jihadization, and then military engagement with a spiritual sanctioner. So those stages are now gone. And yet we see them in this trial now, as they talk about yesterday in the trial. They showed his ISIS flag at home. The defense is trying to say that it meant nothing, when in fact he was becoming what I would call, as a reformist, Islamo-nationalized. He was beginning to separate from American nationalism, which took a decade, and in the last year he quickly adopted ISIS nationalism.
What do you say to people, Zudi, who would respond to you that, well, if ISIS is in all 50 states, why do we have so few attacks overall year in and year out? What do you say to those these are the same people who point out, by the way, well, look at how much gun violence there is versus terrorism violence, but that's a separate discussion. How do you respond when they say that this is essentially an overhyped threat?
Well, number one, this is the tip of the iceberg that we are seeing come to fruition in our homeland, a threat from an ideology that has set up a state in Syria and Iraq that is wreaking havoc in the region, that has a much bigger global reach than simply the acts themselves. Number two, nobody's saying to ignore any other acts, but the bottom line is we've had hundreds and hundreds of arrests, all of whom have come from the Muslim community. Now, not all Muslims are Islamists, but certainly all Islamists are Muslims. And yes, we might need to do some work in other murders on psychiatric issues, etc. But in this issue, when it comes to national security, you have a global movement that's fueled by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 56 countries, some of whom we claim to be our allies, and yet the Saudis, the Qataris, and others might be with us against ISIS, but their countries are cauldrons for this Islamo-nationalism. So until we bond with American Muslims that are reformists, and our Muslim reform movement is all about this, which is trying to give Americans an avenue of how to begin to push a narrative not only that counters violent extremism, which is a symptom, but actually replacing the ideology of Islamo-nationalism with a secular type of Muslim reform that can push back in a positive way and not just do this whack-a-mole against radicals that are going to continue to increase as these refugees spread to the west, as Syria continues to implode. The fuel now is more than it has ever been in anything compared to post-9/11.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Great to have you on. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Buck. Thank you so much for covering this. Appreciate it.